For today, we are going to dive into like the close, deep reading of the request for proposals or RFPs. And hopefully, I'm going to give you a framework of how to read these sometimes impenetrable documents, right? Sometimes they are 100 pages. Hopefully, not for some of you, but others, they're, these documents can be really long. So let's have a strategy to approach them and really understand if what your idea is going to fit with this call. You do not want to waste your time going after funding where that funder just doesn't fund what you're interested in. You don't want to waste your time there. So, putting in the work to really understand what they're looking for can save you time in the long run. Um, we're going to talk about a couple of tools to build a logical argument for what the problem is, lay out why your idea is a good solution, and what will happen if your idea comes to pass. Like, let's make that a really smooth and logical transition between those three ideas. And then, because we cannot work alone, how can we connect with partners who are going to help us do this? And how can we effectively communicate what our idea is, when to bring them in, and how to help build them in to support a project? That's what we're doing today. Excuse me. And that's nested within, if you were here before, you saw this like beefy 12-step program. In the first session, we covered just the first 3 points. Hey, Katie, welcome.
Hey,
Um, and I'm not going to go back through them. Um, it really, that last session was really about just getting yourself organized to be able to approach the grant writing process because there's a lot going on, and future you will thank current you if you can get organized. Okay, but we're on steps 4, 5, and 6 for today. Um, and so as I said, we're going to really dig into this RFP or the request for proposals. And we're also going to like not be scared to ask questions, the funder. We're going to do so. There are some tools to help us really think through the logic. And then we're going to reach out to partners. All right. So diving right in. Okay. Text heavy slide because I'm getting you all used to staring at a lot of text. Um, So, what'll happen is something will float across my email and go, "Hey, we're accepting proposals for this grant." And I'm like, "Great." So I skim the summary and I'm like, "This sounds like it could be promising." And then I do a little bit deeper and I'm like, "Yes, this still sounds like it'll be promising." When I decide to actually go for the funding, I read the entire request for proposal front to back, every word. And I really mean that. Like every single word, I read the entire thing. But I'm not just reading it, I'm taking notes as I do it because you're going to save yourself time ultimately to get organized and not miss something. If you were here the last time, you remember like in every grant I've ever reviewed, a small fraction of people don't even get considered because they don't submit a full proposal. They just miss something and they get excluded from consideration. So, step one, we want to make sure we have a complete and full proposal. And so, taking notes as you read the RFP, request for proposals, is going to be a good way to do that. I would say the very first thing and the thing that's always scary is the deadline is always sooner than you want it to be. Like, no matter if it's 6 months out, you still wish you had 7 months. If it's 2 weeks out, you wish you had 3 weeks. But you should know that. And you should also keep track of the time zones and add them to your calendar, right? If it's due at 5 p.m. Eastern, and you live in California, you only have till 2 p.m. And if you submit it at 5 p.m. your time, it won't be considered. So make sure that all of the work you put in over whatever time scale you have, you actually make it in by the deadline. So that's the very first thing to write down. What is the deadline for this proposal? Um, the other thing is to make sure that it doesn't require something else before you're allowed to apply. The Healthy Soils Grant. So, New Mexico Healthy Soils Program requires you to meet with your NRCS. Oh, maybe you put it in the chat. Thank you. Great. Yes. Yes, we also talked about FSA number. Great. Yes, Healthy Soils Program. So you're required to get that conservation plan from NRCS before you apply. So if you just do your proposal and you've missed that step, you're not eligible. So it's worth taking a peek. Does it require a pre-proposal or a letter of intent? And so I want to, in the subsequent slides, I just pulled from an old grant, excuse me, and I just, for fun, put which page of the RFP I have found this information on, because sometimes you have to dig and figure out where this information is. So here's the deadline, 11:59 Eastern. This was on page 2. This wasn't even like on the first page. It's in a paragraph. Um, and then this is other useful information. Here's when they expect to tell you whether you got it and when you have to start working. Those are all useful, like the when. When is it due? When is the work to be done, right? So if we sort of think of the who, what, where, when, why, these first questions are all the when. All right. So the what? What is the total funding amount? You want to figure out if there's a minimum and a maximum, and you want to make sure you have that number right at the top of your head. If you're proposing something that costs $2 million and the grant is only for 5,000, you're probably not going to get funded because you're going to need to match what you're proposing with the funding amount and that call. And then I also mentioned this, the start date and duration. So far we've looked at the when and the what. What is the amount? How about who? Here are some things that we'll look for the who, right? Um, do you need to have partners? So I'm working on a grant right now from the EPA, and it requires two entities to be in partnership. You can't just submit it if you're only one entity. So in this case, this is made to a single entity. But look, I had to read all the way to page 9 before I found who was eligible to apply for this grant. So, or actually, it was even page 10. This is even, am I even eligible? Right? So, in this case, this one had non-federal entities and individuals are eligible. You could be a government, you could be a city or a county government, you could be a nonprofit, you could be an individual. So we talked about that a little bit in the last session of just making sure that this grant is for you. But in this call for proposals, excuse me, it took me until page 10 to figure out who was eligible. So again, read the whole thing, read it word for word, and take notes as you're doing it. The other useful thing, I know this is often true for producers. You're like, excuse me, boy, I would sure like a new freezer so that I have some, I can process at my leisure. But I also would like a new no-till drill, right? Are you eligible to submit more than one application? That would be really useful. Then you wouldn't have to pick. You could write one proposal for one thing, and you could write another proposal for another thing. But sometimes you're not allowed to submit more than one, and then you would have to pick which is the most important to you. This is an important one to take a look at. In this case, this was buried in page 25 of the 44 pages of RFP. What can you spend money on, right? The whole point of grant writing is we're trying to bring money in to do cool projects, but depending on the funder, they will have limitations of what you can spend money on. If you know me, you know that I complain that the U.S. Department of Agriculture often limits us spending money on food, which is completely crazy to me, but they do. Sometimes they will limit spending money on food. So you just have to pay attention, make sure that you're not asking for something that's not allowed, because then they will not give you the money because it's not allowed. So Often they will say what you can and can't spend money on. Um, so take a look at that. This is getting very deeply into the weeds. We can talk about this more and I can do some examples. But as I said last week, a lot of what I want to do is just have you all familiar with some of the words that are used, and you can dig deeper as they are relevant to you. If they're not, great. You don't have to worry about it. But these are some very nitty-gritty terms that you will see in calls for proposals. So I want you to at least be aware that they exist. So the first is match or cost share. And you will see those words, match, cost share. Um, and match is, so especially for federal government, this is the most common that I see it in federal government. They will say, we are going to give you $50,000, but you have to demonstrate that you are also offering the value of $50,000 to this project for the total project to be a $100,000 project. So, what they're basically saying is, we will fund half of your project and you have to find funding for the rest. Um, I think I mean, it's uh, I could go into my opinions on Match. I think it like in a really positive light, it's demonstrating that you are making the taxpayer money go twice as far, right? Like if you have strong support and you can get volunteers and you have a foundation who will fund half, you are showing the taxpayers that your project has value not just to them, but that there's other people who are putting a stake in the game. Um, on the other hand, securing match and documenting match is really burdensome. My personal opinion is that it creates some undue burden, specifically for people who don't have background in grant management or grant writing, and that is often correlated with people who have been underserved in other aspects. So I have some issues with match, but I don't make up the rules. Match exists. And basically, it's you get some pot of money and you have to secure a different pot of money to get the whole project done. That's match. So here we go. In this RFP that I pulled, this is on page 21, and it says um, must provide a non-federal matching or cost share amount of half. So that would be 50%. Again, on a $100,000 grant, $50,000 would come from the federal agency, and you have to secure another $50,000 to complete your project. All right, so that's the first jargony piece. Usually for individuals, I haven't seen a match amount. So for many of you, now that you know that exists, you can just sort of forget about that until it becomes relevant. However, this indirect or overhead amount, this is often relevant to everyone. Um, the indirect or overhead amount, how I think about it is that the funders understand that if you really detailed to the penny everything that it took to do the project, like, you have to pay the electricity for the internet, you have to um, have a vehicle to be able to, like, there are things like keeping the lights on. You have to be able to use the library account or whatever. There are just times and expenses that it's not worth line item detailing in a proposal. So they understand that you're going to be spending some time and money on things like your internet costs or whatever, and they don't want to see that line itemed. They just go, okay, we know it costs some money to run this grant. We're just going to give you 10% and you don't have to provide receipts, right? So it's like, we know that some portion of this is just going to be expensive to do. You don't have to provide receipts. We will just give it to you directly. And we call that overhead or indirect. Um, so the example I give at the University of New Mexico, UNM takes 52% of the money I bring in, which is crazy. So I write $1 million grant and UNM takes half of that. And then I spend the other 500,000 on my actual project. And that somehow makes sense to me, right? UNM has a lot of facilities. It has the library, it has the autoclaves, it has the people doing the finances, all of that, right? Some portion of my grant is going to pay for all of those services. In contrast, when I worked for Kavira Coalition, we would take 10% of the grant just goes to overhead, right? And that sort of reflects that it was a much smaller institution. Um, and so that that is where that goes. So you can see here, um, so if you were an individual or an individual entity, you actually like having that indirect because you don't have to account for it as carefully. Um, for the Healthy Soil Program grant in particular, you'll notice that the indirect goes to the conservation districts or the other eligible entity. So that doesn't, so whatever you ask for as an individual, a small portion goes to that eligible entity. Um, so that's that indirect. They are administering the grant, they are working with USDA. Okay, that was a lot of jargon. I'm sure there will be questions, but I'm going to move on for now. All of the previous things we've talked about are like not even what they want to fund. It's not even what projects are eligible, right? It's like everything I've said so far could be the same whether there's a grant for building a new ditch or uh I don't know, running workshops, right? So here, finally, what you're going to look for is what are their priorities? What kind of projects are they looking to fund? So are they looking at particular topics? Are they looking for specific groups of people? Sometimes you'll see like acequias are prioritized, or you'll see tribes are prioritized, right? Or activities. Are they looking for educational events, or are they looking for actual implementation, right? So figuring out what they're actually looking for will save you time because if you write your proposal about something that is not their priority, it may be a fantastic proposal and you may not get funded. So here's this was on page 7, and then they said an additional piece was on page 11, right? So again, reading every word meant that I didn't miss one of the priorities. They had a priority for topics and they had a priority for who receives the funding. So you'll hear me say this again. For example, if they write uh, natural biodiversity to control pests as being their priority, you're going to want to use that language as closely as possible in your proposal. You want to remove any shadow of a doubt that your proposal matches their priorities. And a really good way to do that is to just use the words that they use. So that is a hot tip. We will talk way more about that next week, but this is the first time you're hearing that, and hopefully not the last. All right. So you have read through the RFP, and I will send you a template that has all these questions on it, so you can fill that in as you're reading about the grant that you want to apply for. But you maybe still have questions. You've read the whole thing. Oh, my project idea is pretty close, but is it worth applying for? There's this difference. Or this has happened to me. The agency releases really similar calls and I'm like, which one is best for me to apply to? I can't at a glance figure out which one is better. And then this is just the logistic one. In one part it says you have a 10-page proposal, in another part it says 12 pages. What's the real limit? All right, call the program officer. That is always a good idea. Last week, we talked about having a relationship with your funder, that it's okay to call people and ask and just have conversations. I also mentioned last week that there's things that people can say on the phone that they can't necessarily put in writing. So you can have more of a conversation if you just call them. And so on all of the requests for proposals, there'll always be a contact. Um, and just give them a call. Just say, "Hey, I'm applying for this proposal. I got a couple of questions for you. I know you can't, if you can't answer, that's fine. If you can't tell me whether my idea fits the RFP, that's okay, but I just want to, say it out loud to you." The other thing that will really help you in doing that is saying it out loud to another person will force you to put your ideas into a form that you can say out loud to another person. So, doing a pitch to a funder will sort of by definition force you to simplify your idea and be able to talk about it in a 5 or 10 minute conversation. That's a really good thing. If you can take all of the things that you want to do and you can sort of distill it to where you can have a conversation with a stranger, that's going to be really helpful when you go to write your idea down in a simple and clear way. So I totally recommend um, giving people a call, even if you don't have questions, just practice talking about it and getting some feedback. So we have just thought about step 4. Now, on to step 5. This is a part where uh, some people just sort of like eyes glaze over. There are different models and tools to use. They won't all benefit everyone, but I wanted to offer some options, and maybe one works better for you than others. That's great. If one is required, you'll have to do it. If it's not required, I still recommend that it can be helpful. So, SMART goals. I find it helpful to think of what I want the world to look like at the end of if my project is funded and my project does a good job, what do I want the world to look like at the end? And when I mentioned last week that this is why I like grant writing, this part of thinking about like what could the world be like is really exciting to me. So rather than going, oh, I need to build 2 miles of fence and I've gotta, get that no-till drill and I gotta call that guy, right? That is stressful. But being like, man, I really want to like be able to rotationally graze and build soil health. That's cool, right? That's the goal. I want to build soil health and I want to like move my animals through this landscape in a different way. That's my goal. And then the project activities will get me towards that goal. Okay. But meanwhile, this can be a nice checklist and sort of reality check yourself, right? Um, is your goal specific, right? So if I say, I want to build soil health in New Mexico, that is a little vague. New Mexico is very big. So if I say, I want to build soil health on 20 acres in northern Santa Fe County, that is much more specific, right? Sort of something you can sort of see with your mind's eye. Want it to be measurable, and that's specifically measurable. It doesn't mean we have to measure it, but right, like building soil health, there are things that we could look at. We could look at water infiltration rate. We could look at the diversity of the plants on the surface, right? There are things that we can measure. So look at soil health, has to be achievable. All of those things that we looked at in the RFP, how long of a grant do we have? Do we have 1 year to do the project, or do we have 3 years to do the project? Do we have $5,000 to do the project, or do we have $2 million to do the project? All of those things are going to tell us if our idea is achievable, right? Because we have to be within the context of what the grant allows. We want it to be relevant, right? So if someone in New Mexico were like, yep, I'm writing a grant to build, like to improve the coral reefs in the Rio Grande. Well, it's not relevant, right? Like that's it's going to be a really obvious thing that that is not a relevant topic. And then time bound. So similar to achievable, making sure that it's a by when, right? Like there may be a big vision to what you want to see in the world, but can you break off a chunk of it that you can get done in 1 or 3 years, right? So my ultimate goal, indeed, maybe I want to build soil health in all of New Mexico, but what can I do in 3 years, right? So make sure you have a by when. So here we go. Here's an example I have that I forgot that I put in here. Our goal is to improve resilience to future flood events through erosion control. There, I request funding to support 5 ranches in building 1 rock dams in 2021. And so you can kind of see I've got a specific through erosion control and 1 rock dams and 5 ranches, right? That's fairly specific. It's measurable. Someone could walk up and see if I built the 1 rock dams or not. It's achievable. In having done this before, I do know that you can build 1 rock dams across 5 ranches in a year, and it's relevant, right? Building 1 rock dams is related to flood control, right? So I have demonstrated that the problem matches the solution that I'm proposing. You will see this sometimes. You'll see a logic model, um, and it's a way of visualizing the logical relationship between things, right? So this is one I pulled from the internet, and I thought it was fairly simple, right? What is the input? What comes out of it? And then what's that goal? What's that thing that we want to see in the world? And then what are we assuming is happening, right? I was a reviewer for one call, and a lot of people were requesting rangeland seeding. And the assumption that all of these people were making is that it would rain in the season, soon after they put out this rangeland seed. So just being really explicit of saying, man, we know that if it doesn't rain soon after putting out rangeland seed, there's not as good of a implementation success, but we're going to hope or we're going to assume that if it rains, this will do a good job. So just being really explicit with ourselves, what assumptions are we making? um, the other assumption, a lot of erosion control work, since I use that example, is like if you're at the bottom of the watershed, the things that you do, like if you're putting erosion control structures, but no one upstream of you is, you may still be hit with a major flooding event despite the fact that you have put in erosion control structures because the people around you have not. So you're assuming that that your work on your land is going to impact your land, and you may be affected by things, the external factors, right? So these assumptions and these external factors are things to think through, like really reality check what is going to lead to a success or what's going to be a setback. You don't have to put it in the proposal necessarily, but you want to have thought this through so you're ready for all of those eventualities. And better yet, if you can think through what might go wrong and you've already addressed, like, all right, well, if I'm doing range seeding and it doesn't rain, I'm going to rent a water truck and run it across. You'll then demonstrate to the reviewers that you've really thought through how to have a successful project, even if something goes wrong, right? So, doing some of this logical framework can be really helpful um, to making sure that you're proposing a really compelling project that has very clear logical relationships to each other. So here is a much more detailed one, but it's an example. Again, I pulled from the internet. Right? Inputs are like time, money, expertise. Then we do things. We make workshops and we invite people who are low skilled. The outputs are we make videos and we make lesson plans, and then hopefully people learn stuff as sort of these impacts. So you can see this previous one is pretty simplified. You can get highly detailed in how you want to build up the relationships between what you put in, what you actually do, what you actually produce, and then what you think has an impact to the world, right? It's sort of like in this example, these three things are things that you have control over, right? And these three things are what you want, what you do to have an impact in the world. So I won't spend an enormous amount of time, but just showing that this technique can really scale to be as sort of detailed as you want it to be. So I'm just going to introduce this because I've seen it in a couple of proposals lately. Um, you'll also see occasionally people will ask you for what your theory of change is. And I was like, how is that different than a logic model? Like, this is how I think the world will change. If I put in this input, I will get this output. Um, the theory of change gets at the causal pathways. So it's like, I think if I teach people about grant writing, there will be more federal money coming into New Mexico, right? Like, that would be my input and my output in sort of this model, right? Me doing grant writing workshops leads to people applying for grants, which, and the outcome would be more federal money comes to New Mexico. That would be a logic model. But the theory of change would be like, why do I think that's true? Well, the underlying reason is I'm assuming that people haven't been trained in grant writing, and having some time efficiencies of doing it will lead to people doing it more, right? It's me like sort of spelling out why I think my project will work. It's those underlying mechanisms. Like I said, this is rare, but I just wanted to expose you all to the terminology that exists out there. You might see it. Now it won't be the first time. Okay, so now we can kind of, just to really mess with your heads, we can pair those SMART goals and those logic models, right? So here we go. Here was my SMART goal from before. Here's an impact or an outcome. I want to improve resilience um, through erosion control. I want to reduce flooding. That's sort of, again, that thing that I can control. And then I have this activity, right? So you can kind of map on where the logic model came um, based on and how those SMART goals relate to that logic model. And so that's why I said I want to give you all a couple of tools. Some of them will make more sense with your brain than others, but they're all kind of pointing at the same thing. We're trying to get really logical and really clear on how what we're doing will impact what we want it to impact. I talk a lot about trying to um, fundraise efficiently and not waste your time on fundraising. So this is one of the things that I think can really help you is just ballpark your budget as early as possible, because there's always going to be things that you want to do, and you may or may not have enough money in the grant to do them. And it's no point in writing a beautiful essay about how 5 workshops is going to transform soil health in New Mexico if you can only afford to do one. So you should figure out what you can actually afford to do, and then you should build the best project in what you can afford, right? My other tip, and we'll talk about this in the last week, write your budget narrative last, but ballpark your budget close to first. And it's just to keep you from having to make changes everywhere. And then don't forget to pay yourself. Oh my gosh, I have so many farmers and ranchers that won't write themselves in salary even when it's allowed. And you can. You're all worth it. Your time is valuable. If you can pay yourself to do this work, you should. That's my little soapbox. People should get paid for the hard work they do. Um, so, ballparking the budget. Use a consistent template in your organization, and then convert it into what is needed by the granting organization. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense in writing, but I'll show you an example here in a second. And then give yourself a lot of notes. So, for example, if you're trying to do 5 trips of 200 miles, and here's the mileage rate, um, or 8 hours per workshop, right? This level of notes tells me way more than if the only number I write down is 560, right? I'll be like, where did I get that? Why is it not 570, right? This is super clear for myself to be like, okay, why did I think it would cost this much? So, um, this is also a side tip. Um, Sometimes funders ask you to divide out either by quarter or by year. And so if you just do that while you're ballparking, it'll just save you time in the long run. Think about what you'll need either in a quarter or in a year and keep those separate. So here's what an example looks like. This is using like, if anybody uses QuickBooks, maybe this will look familiar as an output from QuickBooks, right? Here are these different codes that are our internal bookkeeping codes. Um, and so, right, I know I want to spend some money on salary and wages, and we have employee benefits, and we have vacation leave and payroll fees. Cool. That's great. But I also want to make myself notes where these three people have their hourly rate and the number of hours that I think they're going to spend on it, right? So this is not something that I would send to the funder. This is so that I know within my organization's financial structure, like how this grant would fit in with our financial structure, so that I can actually sort of calculate, right? Our payroll taxes are 0.05 times our salary or whatever. So, so make it useful to yourself internally. And then, as I said, you can also simplify, right? This is broken out by year. I know I'll need all the supplies in the first year and none in the other 2 years. That's sort of helpful. I probably would prefer to have a notes column so I know what I'm spending supplies on over here, but this would be a great ballpark budget, right? And then this is the kind of thing that the government will ask you to put it into, right? So here's what the Kivira internal codes were. Now I have to translate that into what the government wants it to look like, which is binned into these really small categories. So that's okay. Um, this is a little bit more art than science because it will be different for every entity. And then it, anyway, when you get to this form, just call me again. We'll talk through it. Anyway, these forms get gnarly. All right. So that was budget. Last thing I'm going to talk about is timeline. Thinking through what needs to happen first, what needs to happen second, and what the outcome is. Anything that you can do, again, to get yourself organized and show the reviewers that you know what you're talking about is going to be helpful. So these can, like this is a very pretty one that has cool color coding. This is what I usually do, which is like X's, and I have years and months, and I just say, yep, that's when I think I'm going to do this thing. All right. So here's my image to help you distill all of what I just talked about. So this is Picasso, and I don't know anything about art, but I think the idea is that you're trying to look at a person from all directions at the same time, right? This is the image that I want to convey to you, is if you spend the time thinking of your project from all the different possibilities, like the time angle, the money angle, the logical connections between ideas angle, you will be able to convey a really solid project. And so it's worth it for you to spend that time um, thinking through this really carefully. It will make writing easier, and I promise. It sounds hard to do this up front. You're like, nope, I'm an action-oriented person. I want to get in and start writing. You are welcome to. I recommend that taking a little bit of time and diagramming some of this out will help you with your writing later. That is my, since I am the one talking on this workshop, that is my tip. All right. And last but not least, I'm going to leave it some time for questions, I swear. Um, but having done all of these things, right, thinking through the budget, thinking through the timeline, thinking through what it really takes to do this, you may notice that you cannot do it alone. So you are going to need to talk to collaborators. Because you already thought through everything, you are going to be able to tell them very succinctly what your project idea is and how they might fit into it, right? If you start out saying, well, I'm going to put cover crops on 5 acres and then I'm going to dig this and then I'm going to do that, they're going to be like, so what do you want me to do? But if you're like, my goal is to build regenerative practices on 12 acres and I want to do workshops, and you would be a really great collaborator for this workshop, that helps them understand how they fit in. So I recommend reaching out to collaborators as early as possible. Everybody appreciates a heads up. Nobody likes being written into a grant that they were not expecting to be written into. So definitely being transparent is better. Um, and give them a few bullet points or paragraphs with your key ideas. Um, and again, think of the who, what, where, when, why. I think this is really, really important for building trust and relationships in collaborators. Just be really clear about who is receiving money, right? If you are asking for a letter of support and you are asking for people to volunteer their time, just be really clear about that. If you have funding, you're like, cool, I would like for you to give this workshop and I would like to provide an honorarium of $250. Just be really clear about that. Um, it's so much easier to just be upfront and have that conversation before you have expectations that don't get met, right? So here was an example. We're providing approximately $1,000 to each ranch to support time and materials. Would you be interested in talking more about it? Um, the other um, the other side of this, which I didn't put in the notes, is also be really clear about how open your idea is. Is this at the total brainstorming stage, or is this like pretty clearly solidified and you're just asking for like the last little detail, right? So be really clear. Are you looking for input or are you looking for commitment, right? Maybe think of the like a dating app level of like what am I here for? um, so so this is speaking of being respectful for time. Thank you, Cecilia. I recommend drafting a letter of support template that they can use, right? You are trying to save them time. So, and then I put highlights. I'm like, hey, the only thing you have to do is change the highlighted areas. So, organizational letterhead and the date, any specific interests or excitement that you might have, and then what what are you signing up to do, or what are you signing up to support? Host a workshop, attend a workshop, help distribute promotional material. Um, are you volunteering? Are you donating something? Um, that is all really useful information. And again, being really clear upfront of who's getting money, who is not. Sometimes that's okay. Sometimes people don't feel okay about that. Worth having a conversation sooner than later. So definitely in it's very kind to write a draft letter of support. They can of course change it, but doing that. The other piece is this is just a heads up. Often proposals will need like a team qualifications document, right? Why am I the best person to do this grant, or why are we the best team? Well, Eva is a microbial ecologist and Lisa's a wildlife biologist, and together we're going to write this cool proposal and we have our expertise that supports it. Or, you know, Carlos is a fifth generation rancher and has lived in this community and has these deep networks with the community there. And that's what's going to allow um, talking at this watershed level, right? So you may need to justify why you are the right person to do this. We're going back to that who, what, where, when, why. The who is often you. So thinking of you and your team and what your qualifications are. So it's just worth thinking of that up up ahead. Sometimes it's just short descriptions of the person, and sometimes they require you to upload either a resume or, for academics among us, a CV, or even more obscure is a bio sketch. Um, so if you're part of an organization, I recommend having your staff maintain their professional resumes in a shared folder. And then when you're going to go write this key personnel part, you can just pull from the relevant events of those staff. So, and then of course you're highlighting the most relevant experience from each person, not the whole kitchen sink. All right. So miraculously, we did indeed get through. Whoops, we just did 4, 5, and 6 of our 12-step program. We are halfway there. All right. So we looked at um, deeply reading the RFP. And again, I will send you a cheat sheet that you can fill out to help guide your thinking there. I gave you a couple of tools to help you look at your project every which way so that you're really clear on what you want to do. It makes logical sense. And then you can start talking to partners. You will notice I still haven't asked anyone to write any of the actual proposal yet. We are still in the prep phase. And next week we will start actually thinking about writing. Um, and then we will go from there.